Hello, welcome to Dialogue on CGTN. I'm Pandong in Beijing. After nearly 4 years of conflict, diplomatic efforts to end the conflict in Ukraine appear to be intensifying. Over the weekend, parallel meetings were held in the U.S. state of Florida, particularly in Miami, bringing together U.S., Ukrainian and European officials, while Washington also engaged Russia separately. Draft proposals have reportedly emerged from these discussions, yet Moscow continues military operations and claims new territorial gains, with Russia and Ukraine offering sharply different accounts of the talks and signs of differing approaches emerging between the United States and Europe. Can diplomacy gain traction while the war continues on the ground, or is a lasting peace still out of reach? For more insight, joining me now are Mr. Ruslan Bortnik in the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv, Mr. Andrey Kortunov in the Russian capital of Moscow, Mr. Einar Tangen here in our Beijing studio, and Professor Joav Toker in Paris. Thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen. Let me start with you, Mr. Bortnik. Just before this discussion started, your President Zelensky, has vowed that Ukraine would not give up its set goal of joining NATO. What do you make of the latest remarks from the President?
Hello, colleagues. I think it's not only a political talk and political statement. It's only very important symbolic statement and very important strategical statement. Because if the Russia will receive the right to cut Ukrainian entry into the NATO or another military blocs, it means that Russia has a veto right on Ukrainian international policy. And so Ukraine is trying to avoid any peaceful scenario which demands, which states any Russian vetoes for Ukrainian international cooperation, for Ukrainian military development, and so on. So it's not about the entry on NATO, because the Ukrainian entry into NATO for nowadays, it's impossible scenario. NATO is not ready to accept Ukraine. It's about of Ukrainian freedom and sovereignty, in choosing in direction of international policy and choosing the directions of internal policy without Russian vetoes.
Mr. Kortunov, is this a deal breaker for Russia?
Well, I think it is indeed an issue about the limits of the Ukrainian sovereignty. And I think that in Moscow, they would definitely prefer to have some kind of constitutional commitment of Ukraine not to join NATO. Something like, for example, the Austrian neutrality that we have today. It's also about the limitations on the Ukrainian armed forces, and we don't know the details. We don't know the level of flexibility which the Kremlin might exercise, because the negotiating tactics of the Russian leadership is not to reveal any details. So we might only guess about whether this position is getting more flexible or not. There are some hints, but these hints are mostly limited to tactical issues. For instance, whether Russia should maintain its military presence in Donbass, or this presence might be replaced by the Russian National Guard or the Russian police, things like that. But I don't see a dramatic change in the Russian position on the most fundamental issues of the conflict.
Now, before his latest remarks, Mr. Bortnik, President Zelensky described the latest peace proposals coming from Florida as, and I'm quoting, quite solid at this stage, and says about 90% of Ukraine's demands have been incorporated into the drafts, which center on a 20-point plan with both multilateral and bilateral security guarantees. I think we can be quite sure now to put the NATO issue aside. So, putting that aside, what has been actually achieved for Ukraine during the latest days of talks?
Yes and not at the same moment. Of course, NATO could make a statement that this organization is not going to accept Ukraine. But in the terms of the questions, if Ukraine will decline himself in her constitution the direction to the NATO. It's a hard question. Ukraine is not ready to change our constitution and to decline these amendments. Talking generally, I think we reached a very important stage of negotiation now, because all cards are in the table. This Trump's push to the both sides bring us to the place when we are seeing all real red lines of the science. We are seeing what we are ready to accept or not ready to accept. A huge clarification of the goals, red lines, and means of the sides happened during this negotiation process. But at the same time, and we are very often hearing that 90% of agreement is almost ready. It's true, but the same is true that the most important part of the future agreement is not ready now, because even between Ukraine and the United States, there are no agreements on such points like a territorial swap. There is no agreement on this NATO issue till the end. There is no agreement of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And there are no agreement for another small, very important issues which are staying in our region for more than 20 years, because we are 20 years in this stage. 20 years, not only from the beginning of the war. We are trying to find the solutions for the questions of security guarantees for this region, Ukraine, Russia, and Europe. We are trying to find the solutions for economical cooperation. We are trying to find solutions for Ukraine sovereignty. We are trying to find these solutions almost 20 years. And these issues are not resolved now, even before, between the United States and Ukraine. So because the field of maneuvering for negotiation between the United States and Russia is so big, it's so very narrowed because of absence of this unity between West and Ukraine, between Ukraine and the United States.
Mr. Kortunov, is Russia interested in resolving all those issues just mentioned by Mr. Bortnik? And how does Russia react to the latest round of talks in Florida?
Well, first of all, I agree that we do need a comprehensive political arrangement which clearly goes beyond the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It should involve other European powers, because we are talking about the future European security architecture. And definitely this architecture implies that all the participants, including Ukraine and Russia and European nations, should feel confident that there will be no escalation, that there will be no repetition of this very tragic conflict that we see right now. So in this sense, I think that in Moscow, they are interested in broadening the scope of negotiations, but at the same time, they apparently believe that at least for the time being, European nations are not a part of the solution, but rather a part of the problem, at least for Russia. That what they can bring to the table will complicate the negotiating process even further. And that's why, if you follow the Russian position, they have always been very reluctant to see Europeans at the table, arguing that Europeans have very little, if anything, to bring to the table at this stage. However, just the most recent news, President Macron of France suggested that Europe should restart its own dialogue with Moscow. And if it happens, I think that is a positive sign that might allow all the sides engaged directly or indirectly in this confrontation to finally get together and to try to figure out how they can square the circle and create a system that would be receptive and acceptable to all the sides involved.
Well, Professor Toker, how does the whole European Union react to the latest round of talks? Do they think they're part of the problem or part of the solution this time?
Most Europeans would refuse to judge upon the issues through this prism of are the Europeans part of the problem or the solution? I'd say that for all realistic purposes, of course, the Europeans right now and later on will be part of the solution, because otherwise there's no solution. Whichever way the war goes on, and hopefully ends up one way soon, I hope, then Europeans will stay part of the solution. Will that go through security arrangements, which are indeed negotiated intensively between the Americans and the Ukrainians, between the Europeans and the Ukrainians, and between the Europeans and the Americans? Yes, of course. Even more so, I would say, than territorial issues, which are still far from being clear, mainly regarding what kind of gesture, so to speak, the Ukrainians will do in eastern Donetsk.
Well, Professor, before we talk about Ukrainian territory and territorial integrity, let's talk about EU's internal problems caused by its very aggressive measures and stance toward Russia. For example, the EU has just extended its comprehensive economic sanctions against Russia. And talking about EU's own problems, what about how do electricity and heating bills fare at where you are?
Yes, unfortunately for the Europeans, you were right in stating what you just stated. And this has been the chronic, repetitive, and recurrent problem of the 27 members of the European Union. I will add the British, although Britain is not part of Europe anymore, but in the context we're speaking about, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the British are playing a role, and an important role. Yes, the Europeans do not succeed in installing a common foreign and defense policy. This has been the problem for decades, and it has become more dramatic over the last 4 years almost, since the war in Ukraine took the dimensions it does. So Europeans know that the level of cohesion between the opinions and positions of all of them is far from being satisfactory. But they're working in it, and they point at some elements which indeed mark some success, such as some of the financial arrangements, some of the delivery circumstances through which Ukrainians will have both European and American weapons, and some other elements. Progress has been marked, but it's far from being enough.
Let's talk about this transatlantic challenge. Mr. Tangen, do you think the United States and Europe this time is parting their ways on seeking a possible solution?
Yeah, I think what you have here is the Titanic, and right now people are talking about how to rearrange the deck chairs. Let us be clear. Ukraine is not faring well in the war. The U.S. is looking more to the east than it is Europe. Europe is pretending that somehow things can be brought back to normal on the battlefield. That's not going to happen. This $900 billion quote loan, which seems more a figure of imagination than reality. So in the process itself, you had people generating paper on both sides and getting further afield. The issue of NATO goes to the very security of Russia. Ukraine is one part of it. That's one level. The second level is what my colleague in Russia talked about. The fact is that Russia wants a total security guarantee. And who are they negotiating with? Well, they're negotiating with the Europeans. Well, the last time they negotiated in 2014, it was admitted by Hollande and also Merkel that they were negotiating in bad faith under the Minsk 1 and 2 agreements. So trust is at a minimum. Both sides are not going to give in until they have an understanding that this peace can last. So my thought about this is that it's going to take other nations, other middle powers who have not been involved in the past, people like countries like Turkey, perhaps India, China, those who are willing to stand in and be real negotiators, honest negotiators. I mean, this idea that Macron has that somehow they want to do a Ukraine and France against Russia is laughable. That's been offered many times before. It's a non-starter. The U.S. has to be involved because there has to be assurances of what's going to happen in terms of funding. So right now, I'm not terribly hopeful. Not a great thing to say on Christmas Eve, but let's hope for the best.
Well, Mr. Tangen, before we go any deeper into geopolitics and peace talks, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the format of the recent peace talks involving US, Europe and Ukraine. Do you think the format is a little bit extraordinary this time? Because usually solving a conflict, peace talks should involve confronting sides, whether it's face-to-face or it's going through a go-between.
This is odd to be. It's just beyond odd. The idea that you're putting Ukraine and EU together, and the EU is egging on Ukraine not to give in on NATO, all of these things, and then on the other side you have Russia sitting there generating paper. Both sides are generating paper. The problem is they're getting further apart, not closer together. So I'm not hopeful. I don't believe this 90%. You can say 90% of the issues have been solved, but those are small ones. The big issues are territory and NATO, the ultimate security of this area.
Well, Mr. Bortnik, Ms. Tangen just mentioned this critical issue in any kind of negotiations, that is trust. Does Ukraine trust Europe? Does Ukraine trust the Trump administration?
I don't think so, but I think that these crucial issues could be resolved only during the straight dialogue, face-to-face dialogue between the leaders, between Zelensky, Trump, and Putin, because all these issues they have a huge political impact on internal situation for the countries. For Ukraine, Russia, and other participants of this dialogue. So this toxic influence of these concessions and compromises on these issues may be divided between the leaders looking to eyes to eyes to each other. The official delegation, are not able to resolve these crucial issues. They are able only to make some scenarios, variants for resolutions, but no political decision, of course. So, because for me, the significant point of a peaceful process could be a personal meeting between the leaders. And if we will not see the preparation for the personal meetings between the leaders, it means there is no real chance to find a solution and to find the peace.
So is strategic trust also a big challenge, huge challenge to Russia as well, Mr. Kortunov?
Oh, absolutely, especially as far as Europe is concerned. And indeed, the official narrative in Russia is that Europe abused Russia, that Europeans never took the Minsk agreements seriously, and it was just an attempt to win some time, to provide more weapons to Ukraine. So definitely there is no trust in Europe. As far as the United States is concerned, I think that apparently in the Russian leadership they believe that Trump is indeed trying to resolve the problem, but the position of the United States is not always consistent. We can see some fluctuations in what Trump brings to the table. So there are concerns that Trump might have no patience and no stamina, no commitment that would allow him to remain in the position of the key mediator. So there are concerns about the United States. Besides, we should not forget that the United States uses not only carrots but also sticks as far as Russia is concerned. And we observed new sanctions in October. Nothing prevents Trump from following this path further. So even as far as the United States is concerned, there are doubts that the United States might stay the course for a long time.
Well, Mr. Kortunov, help us understand the Russian approach to these recent negotiating activities. It's not directly involved for sure, but it looks like sometimes observers say it looks like more of a negotiation between the United States and Russia, because usually Trump sends his special envoy to Moscow to convey the latest results of the negotiations going on between US, Europe and Ukraine.
Well, that's probably right. And Also, I think it's important to be mindful that the Russian leadership is clearly interested in maintaining a dialogue with the United States, not only on Ukraine, but on other issues. They are interested in pursuing strategic arms control initiatives. They are interested in discussing some regional conflicts with the United States, maybe even some economic cooperation plans. So the agenda is broader than this conflict, and they don't want to burn bridges to the Trump administration. That's why, for instance, in Moscow, they avoid any explicit criticism of Donald Trump. They can criticize European leaders, and this criticism is very strong, but they avoid criticizing Donald Trump, even when Donald Trump makes certain steps which are perceived as unfriendly by the Russian Federation.
Professor Toker, how will the European Union approach Russia? Because eventually you have to. This is a Russia-Ukraine conflict. But so far, we've seen that there's no let-up from the European side. For example, we just mentioned that EU has just extended its economic sanctions against Russia. And there has been repeated calls within the bloc to use frozen Russian assets for Ukraine in a way. So how will the EU approach Russia eventually?
Well, the EU will just go on with this sort of unsatisfactory methods, which is actually a defensive one, namely stay as pragmatic as possible. Keep talking, keep negotiating with whoever, but mainly you're absolutely right. The Europeans are not negotiating, as far as we know, with the Russians. They do negotiate intensively with the Ukrainians and to a large extent with the Americans, but they're not in direct contact with the Russian part, specifically not regarding tax and technical conditions and some other circumstantial material which is important, if ever there's going to be a breakthrough. Now, I personally do not think that a breakthrough is actually awaiting across the room. It is not, unfortunately, so we just go on with the four major partners just going on with their pragmatic navigation. I think none of the parties has an interest in seeing the negotiations stopped brutally, but I'm afraid that the Russians are not interested in putting an end to fighting, so this is where we're going to head in the foreseeable future.
So in that scenario, Mr. Tangen, how will the United States push forward any possible peace talks in the near future?
Well, I think Donald Trump is close to washing his hands of the whole thing, just saying, well, we can't get them to do anything, so, leave it to the Europeans. He's already wants to sell them more arms. This certainly would help. We don't know if that $900 billion is actually going to materialize. But right now, Europe before famously said this is going to be settled on the battlefield. Unfortunately, it will be. But it's not going to be in favor of the Ukraines or Europe. Russia right now is taking more territory as we speak. The Ukrainian army is being ground down. Russia is much larger, and they can stay in this fight longer. So, unfortunately, every day that goes by, what Minsk 1 and 2 offered right now would be, pure gold for both Europe and Ukraine. Then it would have had a united Ukraine. There would have been special circumstances in which all the provinces would have to unanimously agree to join NATO or do anything that would upset the balance, but it would have been one nation. So what do we have? So many people dead. The United States no longer interested. Europe pursuing a fantasy, and Ukraine in the middle, suffering because of the inability of these people around them to be honest brokers.
What's your take on this, Mr. Bortnik? Going back to Minsk 1 and 2 is impossible right now?
And that's a problem, because if you divide this peaceful process for some stages, we are now in the first stage only, preparation of the agreement. And this stage is not so important even like a fulfillment of the agreement, because Minsk agreement we were prepared but not fulfilled. So I'm still some pessimistic about the future of this peaceful negotiation, because we are on a very early stage of the negotiation process and very far away from the peaceful agreement. But for Ukrainian people, even the ceasefire could be a great solution, because it means the end of the hot time of the war, it means the saving of the lives, it means the rebuilding the peaceful life.
Well, Mr. Bortnik, let me quickly follow up on this fighting while negotiating scenario. How will Ukraine deal with it? Because let's face it, war is very expensive in current times.
We are not fighting for our own money. We are still able to fight because of Western support. An additional 90 billion of euros from European Union is strengthening Ukrainian position in negotiation also. So we are still able to fight for a few years at least. And nobody knows what will happen in the future.
Mr. Kortunov, what's your take on this? Fighting while negotiating, is this the Russian tactic for now?
Well, it is the Russian tactic for now. I think that what we could hope for is that negotiations might lead to a degree of de-escalation. And I recall that there were some proposals to limit strikes against the critical infrastructure or strikes against the Black Sea region, or maybe some other limitations. If there is a de-escalation, that would already be a major accomplishment, even without a full, complete ceasefire. But I'm not sure that we are close to even limited de-escalation at this juncture. I hope that I'm mistaken, but I don't see that looming on the horizon.
Well, Ms. Tangen, very quickly, what do you make of the prospects of ceasefire or peace deal in very near future?
Very slim. Right now, because of the gains that Russia is making on the ground in the intransience of Ukraine and Europe. If they had signaled that something could happen, I think there was a chance. But right now, with it coming out and saying there's, NATO's not on the list and territory is not on the list, that makes it further apart, which means it'll continue.
Well, Professor Toker, very quickly, how will Europe deal with the situation at hand, or at least will Europe let up the pressure on Russia?
Europe will try to stay in the posture of keeping on the pressure on Russia, even perhaps putting more pressure on Russia, but how much of it would be postures and how much of it would be with real efficiency, I'm not too optimistic.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your insight. And with that, we end this edition of Dialogue on CGTN. I'm Pandung in Beijing. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. Thanks for being with us. Stay tuned.